What's everybody doing?
Yeah. I'm about to make some pasta.
Who's making pasta? I could actually use some pasta. Hey, Dr. Judd.
Hello.
All right, looks like we're still adding people. Before we get started, do you guys have any questions about your literature summary grades from last time or about the upcoming literature summary that you're writing for Friday?
We've had some really productive discussions, I think, with some of the students some of you who have come in to talk about the paper and go over a draft, something like that. So don't be afraid to make use of that resource.
All right, you're meeting with your students tomorrow in lab in their lab spaces, is that correct, Dr. Judd?
It looks like, I'm going to clarify in the email I send out, it looks like Zoom is actually going to might end up making the most sense for some of my groups because so many people have not. But you guys should get an email about that this afternoon.
All right. Be working on getting data together because we would like to go through data analysis with you next week before you leave for Thanksgiving. So put that on top of your priority of things to get done for lab. The sooner we have the data, the sooner we can work on data analysis so that we're ready to meet with you next week and go through that information with you. Where did we end up last time? We looked at the balance of the carbon cycle. Does anybody have any questions about carbon cycle?
When you're studying your notes on the stuff we covered last time, go back and pay attention to how we set up the equation, or how Dr. Point set up the equation balancing a budget. That's a really useful way to look at this kind of stuff.
Yeah, so we were basically looking at the flow of carbon into ecosystems through photosynthesis and the flow of carbon out of ecosystems through respiration by organisms that are alive, respiration due to soil microbes in the form of soil respiration. And those two things are slightly imbalanced, such that about 5 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year get stored in the soil. And what happens when humans are active in ecosystems is we dig up fossil fuels, export some carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels. And then we also convert land from forests to agriculture in most cases through fire, burning those forests down to clear land for agriculture. And so that releases more carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere through volatilization, through burning biomass. And that far outstrips the 5 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year that would normally be stored in soil. So rather than it being a system that is net storage, it is a system that is net export back to the atmosphere. And I need to check something real quick here.
Before you move on,
Okay.
I just want to say something about the carbon cycle. So the Kanza Prairie system and your everyday life is generally focused on the kind of the fast portion of the cycle. So plants pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and then it's released back into the atmosphere either through plant respiration or through the respiration of herbivores and detritivores. So this region up here and at the upper portion is kind of that fast cycle. We talked briefly about groundwater, which is not connected here, and we talked a little about fossil fuels. I wonder if somebody out there can tell me what oil is made of. Where does oil as a fossil fuel come from? Do you guys know that?
I think I mentioned it last time.
You did, but I didn't get a sense that, well, I want to make sure people know this because it's an important thing to know when we talk about climate change and fossil fuels. Or alternatively, does anyone know what coal is made out of, where it comes from?
Coal, like highly pressurized carbon, basically, or it was like put under a lot of pressure.
Yep, and where does that carbon come from? Why is there carbon to be under pressure?
Like organisms and stuff.
Yeah, coal is almost entirely plants. It's plant material that's that would build up in what normally would be soil, but it's usually saturated, so there's no oxygen to break down the plant material to undergo cellular respiration and release it back into the atmosphere. So coal is almost entirely land plant material, and oil is almost entirely algae material. So photosynthetic organisms that whose biomass didn't get returned to the atmosphere through CO2.
And you should have known that the answer was old fossilized plants because a paleobotanist was asking the question. Yeah, so one way to think about carbon dioxide release from fossil fuel deposits is you're basically burning off a ton of old photosynthesis. So this movement out of the atmosphere into plants and then eventually into soil and then eventually over time into fossil fuels, you're burning off all of that stockpiled photosynthetic activity in the form of driving your car and heating your house and things like this. And so that's a source of basically old dead plants that then is being released from its storage deep in the earth, and that then contributes to this this overall increase that we see in carbon dioxide levels. And because carbon dioxide is one of these gases that is implicated in global warming, it contributes to this problem here. This is a figure from the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And basically this is the actual record of global temperatures. And as you can see, this has been going up. And then the green and the blue shaded areas are the model outputs from models that simulate what you would expect to be seeing with just natural factors, and then what we would expect to see if you had both natural and human factors. And those human factors, once again, are primarily burning fossil fuels and converting land from land that would tend to store carbon versus land that is having more carbon released because of things like land use change. And the models tend to go along with the implication of human factors rather than just natural factors. These dips in the global temperature that you see here, for example, and here, what are causing those dips? Anybody know? What would cause the entire Earth to cool off a little bit?
Maybe the ocean temperature going down.
Not ocean temperature. No, oceans, because they're just big bodies of water, and water has a high specific heat. Water takes a lot of energy to change temperature, so it absorbs a lot of energy before it changes temperature. And so, if anything, ocean temperatures are going to kind of have moderating impacts. That's why coastal regions generally have less severe weather fluctuations than continental environments, for example. It's a good guess, but all the qualities of water that make it unusual and different than a lot of other substances actually have a moderating effect. If you're out on a hot day on the beach, what do you want to do when it gets really hot? Lots of beaches have these. Sometimes you rent them, sometimes they're free. It depends on the quality of the hotel you're staying at.
Get some shade.
Yeah, you can go under the umbrella. And so there must be something happening in the world during these short periods of time when we see dips. There must be something that is sending stuff up in the atmosphere that kind of acts like an umbrella.
Volcanic ash, maybe?
Volcanic ash is exactly what's going on. So those dips in global temperature are due to volcanoes spewing a lot of ash up in the atmosphere. And then in some cases for 2 or 3 years, you'll see a slight global decline in temperature because you just have all these particles shading out sunlight, reducing the thermal gain of the Earth. And then over time, those things kind of fall out of aerial solution, and then the sky clears up, and you have the temperature going back to kind of normal background levels again. So that was the carbon cycle. Any questions about the carbon cycle? All right, then let's talk nitrogen. Nitrogen is way more complicated than carbon. What's that?
You asked them to explain the sawtooth pattern at the beginning of class today.
Oh, crap, I did, didn't I? I asked you guys to explain why this carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere fluctuate. Each of these dots is a month. And so some months are higher than other months, then it goes back up again, then it comes back down again. It's going inexorably up, but it oscillates as it goes up. Why does it oscillate? Thanks for reminding me, Nathan.
Mm-hmm.
If you're near a window, go to a window and look outside and see what's happening to the trees.
It gets cold, so everything dies and is returned back to the oil, to the soil.
So these trees, are they dying or are they doing something else?
They're like giving off their leaves in order to conserve energy.
Okay, so they're basically dropping their leaves. They're dropping their leaves because day length is declining, which means that they're doing less and less photosynthesis each day. They're also doing less and less photosynthesis because as they get colder, all metabolic processes kind of slow down. And so if they're not doing as much photosynthesis as they were doing before, but they still have their leaves, what's going to happen to them over time? Even though it's getting cold, they still have the possibility of losing what precious resource? Because they have leaves. This goes back to Dr. Judd's treatment of C3 and C4 photosynthesis.
He's asking what two processes normally happen in a leaf and how does their balance change as you go from warm summer conditions to cooler winter conditions, cooler and darker winter conditions.
Photosynthesis and photorespiration.
Not photorespiration, but
Cellular.
Yeah.
actual cellular respiration. There you go. So these two processes are going on. So a tree is big. It's got a lot of mass in it. A lot of that mass is actually just dead and not metabolically active, but there's plenty of that mass that is metabolically active. And so it's always going to be going through the process of cellular respiration. The hope of a tree, if trees could have hope, and I don't know, and some days I hope that trees do have hope. The hope of a tree is to do more photosynthesis and generate more energy through photosynthesis than it loses through cellular respiration. That's how trees grow and they get big and they get woody. But during the winter, they're doing less and less photosynthesis, but they're also continuing to do cellular respiration. So they basically get to the point where doing photosynthesis isn't really gaining them anything. But as long as they have their leaves and their leaves are healthy, they're still doing photosynthesis. They're just not doing photosynthesis at the same rate. What do leaves often, what do leaves always lose as they're bringing in carbon dioxide to let carbon dioxide in? As they open their stomata, what gets lost?
They'll lose water.
They lose water. And so even though it's getting colder and so it's not as hot, so they're not going to lose as much water, as long as you hold on to those leaves that have stomata, you're going to be losing water. And so what leaves do in temperate regions, and trees also do this in tropical areas where there are pronounced dry seasons. And so this is another way you can think of this more as a water loss issue than a seasonal issue or a temperature issue. In the tropics during dry seasons, trees lose their leaves during the dry season because they don't want those leaves to be losing a lot of water, in the same way that trees in the winter in temperate regions lose their leaves because at a time when photosynthesis isn't really giving them many gains, they still risk losing water through those leaves being present. So now that we know that they're losing leaves, what explains the pattern here of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? When would you expect CO2 to peak and when would you expect CO2 to decline in the atmosphere?
It would peak in the winter and start to decline as the plants started processes again.
Okay, good. Can you explain that a little more, Keaton?
So in the winter, they're conserving energy more, and so like they're not taking in carbon through their leaves or transferring that.
So they're declining the rate of photosynthesis because they've dropped their leaves. What do they continue to do? They've dropped their leaves, no photosynthesis, but the tree is still alive. So the tree is still doing what?
The carbon cycle.
Well, what specifically? Can you see the slide?
They're still using glucose.
Yeah, they're still doing cellular respiration. So when you see plants continuing to do cellular respiration, but they're not taking any carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere due to photosynthesis, that's why the carbon dioxide levels are creeping up. And then you're right, as they green up and start doing photosynthesis again, photosynthesis moves at a faster rate than cellular respiration does, and so they start taking carbon dioxide out. So you see carbon dioxide levels declining during the growing season and then creeping back up during winter, declining during the growing season, creeping back up in winter, declining in the growing season, creeping back up in winter. But if you looked at these data carefully, what you would see is that this decline is the northern hemisphere growing season, and the increase is the northern hemisphere winter. Why does the northern hemisphere govern these dynamics of carbon dioxide, these seasonal dynamics of carbon dioxide?
Could it be because most of the leaving plants are deciduous, and so they need to lose their leaves, while in the southern hemisphere they're not? They don't need to because there's sunshine all year round.
So that's certainly part of it, but there's another part of it that deals with something that I think Dr. Judd had mentioned at one time. When you look at a map of the Earth, what do you remember about the distribution of land masses on the surface of the Earth?
The sun more directly hits the equator.
That's true, but that was not where I was headed.
Oh, okay.
Most of the land mass is in the northern hemisphere.
That is where I was headed. Most of the land mass of the continents is in the northern hemisphere. And so anything that happens with plant communities in the northern hemisphere is going to have a big effect on something like carbon cycling, simply because that's where a lot of the land mass is. So thanks for the reminder. Anything you want to add to that, Dr. Judd? Can't hear you.
No, you hit that last point, which was good. That there's a lot more forests at temperate and northern temperate latitudes in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere, because it's all water down there.
Yep. And Daniel also makes a good point that a lot of those forests in the northern hemisphere are deciduous forests, and so they do go through this process of dropping their leaves.
Connor asked in the chat about evergreen trees like conifers and pines, and they have the same problem as deciduous trees, especially in Canada and Russia and those northern latitudes. But they just have, instead of dropping their leaves, they have specific adaptations in their leaves that prevent water loss, like being waxy, being small, needle-like, and having chemicals in the leaves that prevent freezing.
Yeah, one of the advantages of having a needle-like leaf is that it's closer to circular rather than flat. So there's a lot more volume relative to surface area, which would then prevent water loss somewhat. Okay, now we can get to nitrogen. And unfortunately, nitrogen is really complicated. So I'm going to do my best to work through this. So nitrogen is generally thought of as a limiting resource. What do I mean when I say it's a limiting resource? Think back to the Tillman way of thinking about resource competition. What would the lack of nitrogen limit in a group of organisms? A group of plants.
Would it limit like specific plants that need a lot of nitrogen to live in an area?
Yeah, and so when you think about that a little more fully, it's limiting population growth. And so when you think about those zero net growth isocyclines in a Tillman style graph, what you're basically modeling is what is the lower limit of, for example, nitrogen supply and light supply that a species needs in order for it to experience positive population growth. And so the zero net growth isocycline line, so when we have the graph of light, I'll just draw it up here, and nitrogen, when we draw a zero net growth isocycline that tells you that you need this much light and this much nitrogen. You need that much light and that much nitrogen because this is a zero net growth isocycline, zero net growth, and that growth is population growth. If you have more nitrogen than that, you experience positive population growth. If you have less nitrogen than that, you experience negative population growth. If you have more light than this, you experience positive population growth. But if you have less light than that, you experience negative population growth. So nitrogen is one of these limiting resources that limits population growth. But if you look in the atmosphere, 78% of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. So one question is, why on earth would nitrogen be a limiting resource if it's so super abundant?
Because maybe the amount of nitrogen in the soil.
No, it has to do with the form of nitrogen in the atmosphere. This is the form of nitrogen in the atmosphere. It's two nitrogen atoms bonded together with a triple bond. So why, if nitrogen in this form is so abundant in the atmosphere, would we consider it to be a limiting resource, for example, for plants to grow, to experience positive population growth?
Would it be like that, like plants can't take it in that form, but because of the triple bond, it's like harder to break apart to get it to that form for them to use?
Okay, I'm having a little trouble hearing you, but I think what you said is that it's hard for organisms to absorb because it's in this form where you have these two atoms that are triple bonded together, and triple bonds are hard to break. Did I catch that right?
Yes.
Okay, all right, awesome. Because that is exactly what is going on. You have these triple bonds, so you have 3 times the bond strength that you would have if something was just with a single bond, and those bonds are very, very hard to break. And so the only kinds of organisms that can get access to this atmospheric form of this gaseous form of nitrogen are those organisms that have enzymes that allow them to break that nitrogen apart without requiring a ton of energy input. So nitrogen fixation is this process by which we take into and we convert it to ammonia, NH3. And it takes a huge amount of energy, 16 ATPs, in order to facilitate this reaction. And as a result of that, this is generally only carried out by bacteria. And these are bacteria that have the necessary enzymes to facilitate the heavy energy requirements required to break atmospheric nitrogen apart so that you can then add hydrogens to that to create ammonia. So in some cases, these bacteria live in association with plants. They live in association with the root nodules of legumes. Can somebody tell me what the family of legumes are again? It used to be the Leguminosae, and now it's a different family.
They're fabulous, everybody.
Oh my gosh. He practically gave it to you.
Is it like the Fabaceae, or I can't remember how to pronounce that?
The fabulous Fabaceae. These are things like lead plant, purple prairie clover, as we've been giving you plants and animals of the day, many of the prairie forbs that we've given you, we've told you, we've pointed out when they were in the family Fabaceae. And the reason that we've pointed that out is because Fabaceae is this family of plants that has root nodules. If you look on the roots, there are little balls attached to the roots, and in these little root nodules are bacteria that go through the process of fixing nitrogen. And we'll talk about that symbiotic relationship here in a little while. So we have some bacteria that are found in association with the roots of plants, and then we also have free-living bacteria in the soil that are possible of fixing nitrogen. Most of these things are heterotrophic, which means that they get their energy from other organisms, but the cyanobacteria that are capable of doing this are autotrophic. They do photosynthesis. So once you've taken this atmospheric nitrogen and converted it into ammonia, it can be made available to plants. Plants are capable of absorbing it, and then they can metabolize that ammonia and turn it into all sorts of other things like amino acids and other nitrogen-containing compounds. So nitrogen fixation is the first step in making nitrogen available to the plant community primarily. And then once that nitrogen is in the biotic, in an organic form, it's then capable of moving from one organism to another through a nutrient cycle. So the enzyme that you need is called nitrogenase. It is the enzyme that catalyzes fixation. It contains molybdenum, iron, sulfide groups, so it's complicated enzyme, and it uses ATP as its energy source. And once again, the whole point of all of this is it just takes a lot of energy to break that triply covalent bond. You have to use about 10 grams of glucose to fix about 1 gram of nitrogen. And so it's an amazingly energy intensive process. We'll talk later about, or will we talk later yet? Yeah, we'll talk later about Fritz Haber, who is a chemist who invented an industrial way of doing this. But once again, that industrial way of doing this also requires a huge amount of fossil fuel in order to facilitate the fixation of atmospheric nitrogen. So nitrogen fixation is once again facilitated by the bacteria that live inside of these root nodules. So this is a root of a legume, and these are the root nodules. And these root nodules basically form by the root sending out a root hair that surrounds naturally occurring rhizobia bacteria, and then basically encapsulates them in this outgrowth of the plant cell, which is what a root hair is essentially. And essentially the nodule grows as an infection, if you want, inside the root, and the plant provides cellular growth that goes around and encapsulates the bacteria. And in these nodules, they basically absorb nitrogen from the air spaces that are found in soil typically. And they will take in that nitrogen and basically use nitrogenase to convert that nitrogen into ammonia. That then is picked up by the vascular tissues that also extend out into these root nodules, and then that nitrogen can be transported around the plant body the way that they would transport any other substance, water, sugars, etc. So in this mutualism, so this is a mutualism, and we've talked before. Have we talked about? Yeah, we've talked before about interspecific interactions. Did we talk about all of them, Nathan, yet?
It's kind of blending with my other class right now, so I don't actually remember if we did it.
Well, and I've already talked about them in my ecology of food class also, so I'm having trouble keeping things separate as well. So one way that you can look at any interspecific interaction is you can ask yourself, what's the effect to species A and what's the effect to species B in this interaction? So if we have two species involved in an interaction, what's the cost or benefit to species A and B in a mutualism? In mutualism, does species A benefit? Does species B benefit? Do both of them benefit? Do neither of them benefit?
Doesn't one benefit and one is like unaffected?
That actually is,
What was that,
Oh,
commensalism?
we did talk about commensalism and facilitation in that context. That's right. We did see-
commensalism.
Yeah.
Commensalism would be a positive effect of one and no effect on the other. Yeah, that's commensalism. But start thinking down that line, down that path.
Both positive?
So mutualism is both positive. And so this is a mutualism in that there's something positive that the bacterium gains and there's something positive that the plant gains. Let's go through the rest of these. You guys have talked about competition at some length now. What are the pluses, minuses, or zeros for competition? What's the effect of competition on these two species? And you can also think of these in terms of, would the populations be experience positive population growth, negative population growth, or zero population growth, or more population growth or less population growth, depending on how you want to think about it.
One is positive and one is negative.
That would actually be something like predation or parasitism, where
So-
one is positively affected at the expense of the other. But how is competition different from that?
There's not a direct impact in competition, right?
Oh, there is. We modeled it. That's what alpha and beta are, right?
Ask yourself, for each of the two species in this little pair of species interacting, would each one do better or worse if the other one wasn't there?
Is it two minuses?
It would be two minuses. And you know this because when you look at the Lotka-Volterra equations, an individual that is not limited by its own growth would just be growing exponentially. But then we model intraspecific competition by that species having a negative effect on its own carrying capacity. But then we can add a second species by then subtracting from that also the effect of the other species on it. So the fact that there's a negative out here in front of this competition coefficient indicates that one species is having a negative effect on the other. And for two species to be in competition, both species have to have a negative effect on the other. If it's a situation where that isn't the case, it's because one species is being negatively affected while the other species is being positively affected. And so these are some of the interspecific interactions and how we can think of them in terms of the effects of the two species on one another or not. So when we think of symbioses, so you will see people misusing the word symbiotic a lot. Symbiotic just refers to two organisms that are in a close interaction with one another. A mutualism is a symbiotic relationship where you have both organisms benefiting from that close association. So I prefer referring to the specific interaction rather than using symbiosis as a term.
Yeah.
I don't know how Nathan feels about it. What's that?
You could almost say coronavirus is in a symbiotic relationship with humans right now, and it is not positive for the humans.
Yeah.
That's how you can remember that that's not necessarily good just because it's symbiotic.
So yeah, so oftentimes people equate symbiosis with mutualism, but there are lots of symbiotic relationships. Not all of them are mutualistic. So what are the two partners getting in this relationship? It's a close relationship. The bacteria are right up against the vascular tissues of the plant. One of these should be easy. What's the plant getting from the bacteria?
Nitrogen.
It's getting a nitrogen supply, so it doesn't have to send out really wide roots to really harvest nitrogen from a big volume of soil. What's the bacterium getting from the plant?
Is it glucose?
It's getting glucose. So what does the plant have a lot to spare typically? We talked about how when a plant is out there with all of its leaves, it's doing a lot more photosynthesis than it's giving up energy in terms of cellular respiration. So generally, you can think of plants as running kind of the opposite of an energy deficit. What's the opposite of a deficit, Nathan? Surplus. They're running an energy surplus, and so they can easily afford to give up a little bit of energy to bacteria to get bacteria to do this job of fixing nitrogen. Now, neither the bacteria nor the plant is thinking about any of this. It's just that that there is this exchange of materials, and the bacteria gains from being in association with the plant by getting energy from the plant, and the plant gains from the bacteria by getting nitrogen. It's only when you have these mutual gains that you might expect this type of close association to evolve over time, because there are benefits to both species of the interaction. So we answered both of these questions. How do plants benefit from symbiotic relationships with these nitrogen fixing bacteria? They get the nitrogen. Now, one of the things that has happened over time is humans have increased global fixation by a lot. And we do this a variety of different ways. One of the ways we do this is we plant nitrogen fixing crops. The most common nitrogen fixing crop in the United States is soybeans. It's also a legume in the family Fabaceae. And we harvest soybeans and we put them in animal feed. And I just made tofu the other night. Tofu is basically soybean curd. And as you grow these nitrogen fixing crops, their plant bodies are filled with nitrogen. And when you plow those crops under, that nitrogen gets returned to the soil. And so there's a lot more nitrogen fixing going on from the increase of the use of these nitrogen fixing crops than if humans weren't doing agriculture. There's also fixation that happens when we burn fossil fuels. And then I've already mentioned industrial fixation through the Haber-Bosch process. And so this is the process of essentially taking fossil fuels, using the energy from fossil fuels to fix nitrogen. And so when we put nitrogen into the atmosphere that has been fixed through these two methods, and some of this nitrogen fixation ends up getting in the atmosphere, and a lot of nitrogen gets in the atmosphere from fossil fuel combustion. This stuff then falls back to the earth, either through wetfall, through rain and snow and clouds and things like this, or it comes back to the earth just through the deposition of dust. If you've ever owned a house, you realize that you have to dust it periodically. Well, all that dust is just particles that are floating around in the air and fall down out of aerial solution. Well, any nitrogen that is in the air that is not N2 is also going to fall out of solution as well over time. And we'll talk about what some of the consequences are of these human perturbations to the nitrogen cycle, assuming that we have time today. So remember that when we're talking about nitrogen, well, when we're talking about any nutrient cycle, we can think about nitrogen, we can think about fluxes, flows of energy back, or flows of materials back and forth between pools. Nitrogen fixation is a flux, but it is also a transformation. And it's a flux because we're moving nitrogen from the atmosphere to soils, but it's also a transformation because we're changing it from gaseous nitrogen to ammonium. And another flux that is also a transformation is this process of litter fall and death, where you go from live organic matter to dead organic matter. Now, it's listed here as a transformation, not because the matter is changing form, but because the organism itself is changing form. So I didn't make up these slides, actually. I would maybe argue that this is not as much of a transformation as some of the other transformations, because the compounds are still amino acids and nitrogenous bases and things like that, and they haven't been broken down. But we do talk about it differently because live organic matter is different than dead organic matter in terms of the processes that go on in those two forms of matter. But then decomposition is a transformation that takes that dead organic matter and breaks it down into dissolved organic matter, which is the form of nitrogen that occurs in the interstitial spaces in soil. And so once again, this is going to be a breakdown of dead organic matter into dissolved organic nitrogen that occurs as a result of leaching, fragmentation, changes in chemical structure, ingestion by soil inhabiting microbes, and ingestion by soil inhabiting invertebrates and things like this, and then they excrete those things. And so we're really talking about decomposition as the breakdown of these dead bodies, either dead leaves that are falling all around us now. At my house, we are in the process of putting off our leaf raking. But if we don't rake up those leaves that are in our driveway and just leave them there over winter, and then try and rake up those leaves in the spring as things start to green up and everything, when we rake up those leaves, we're going to find a layer of soil at the bottom of those leaves, and it's going to be harder to clean up the driveway because those leaves have been undergoing a season of decomposition and breaking down and essentially getting converted back into soil. So the organisms that do this are bacteria and fungi, but also there are plenty of insects and things like this that also contribute to decomposition. And the rate that this takes place is influenced by a lot of abiotic factors like temperature, moisture, the quality of the plant litter, soil disturbance. All of these abiotic factors can have an influence on how quickly something decomposes. Do any of you guys watch crime shows at all?
Love crime shows.
You love crime shows. So whenever you see somebody try and make a determination of time of death, they'll do things when it's a relatively recent death. They'll do things like taking the core temperature of the body and things like that. But if it's a person who's been dead for a longer period of time, there are other ways in which you can estimate the time of death, and it has to do with how quickly that corpse is decomposing. And so there are body farms. You guys know what a body farm is? Yeah, it's a body farm where people who donated their bodies to science, some of those bodies go to body farms where they put dead humans out in the landscape, and they basically come by and monitor them periodically to see what's happening to the body as it goes through the process of decomposition. And because of that, with human bodies, we know a lot about how temperature and moisture and the presence of insects, et cetera, affect the rate of decomposition. Biologists also do this with leaves. So you could actually put different types of leaves out in a common environment, and you'll see that different species of leaves decompose at different rates. And that's largely due to the quality of the leaf that goes down there. If it's a very nutritious leaf without a lot of cellulose protecting those nutrients, it decomposes faster than if it's a low quality leaf where that leaf has protected those nutrients better with either thicker layers of cellulose around the cells or lignin around the cells and things like that.
You guys have actually been measuring specific leaf area, or we'll be able to calculate it in lab, where you have the area of the leaf and the mass of the leaf. And the higher the specific leaf area, the longer it lasts, the more time it takes to decompose, generally.
All right, ammonification is the process of taking this dissolved organic nitrogen and converting it into ammonium, the ion. Now, when it occurs in ionic form, it's really easy to move from place to place in soils, for example, because it can bond to water, which is a polar molecule, and be drugged around through things like leaching. So microbes basically take up the dissolved organic nitrogen and they secrete NH3. And then this NH3 is very quickly converted into ammonium. And this is controlled by, once again, a variety of factors. The availability of dissolved organic nitrogen. This equation can only move as fast as the amount of reactants that it has to work with. It's also influenced by the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the microbial community. If it's a microbial community that needs a lot of nitrogen, this process is going to go faster. And it's affected by temperature, obviously, because all metabolic processes are affected by temperature. And it's also affected by moisture, mainly because moisture influences the health of the microbial community. And so the more microbes you have doing this, the faster this is going to happen. And this is all happening in soil. Nitrification, though, is another process that also happens in soil, and it's the conversion of ammonium ions to nitrate. And nitrate is oftentimes what we think of as one of the more useful building blocks when organisms are building things like proteins. Nitrification, once again, it's going to get so tiresome that all of these processes involve bacteria. And so bacteria get carbon from dissolved organic carbon in the soil, and they get energy from the ammonium ions. As they break down ammonium and add oxygen to it, it releases the energy in ammonium. And so this is, once again, just a metabolic process by which some bacteria get their energy. And so specific bacteria like Nitrosomonas and Nitrobacter derive energy from this oxidation of ammonium. It requires oxygen, clearly, because one of the end products is a nitrogen with 3 oxygens attached to it rather than a nitrogen with 4 hydrogens. And once again, it's limited by the availability of ammonium. So plants can take up nitrate, ammonium, and amino acids. And so that's why these different forms of nitrogen in soil are so important, because when plants assimilate these forms of nitrogen that are down in the soil, they're basically absorbing these different forms of nitrogen through their roots. And so if you think about all of the different organisms that can influence assimilation, who would those be? If you're thinking of plant uptake, what is plant uptake of nitrogen going to be limited by? So this plant here needs nitrogen. Where's it getting its nitrogen from?
The bacteria.
Not the bacteria directly, typically. I mean, it can if it's a legume, but what is this part of this diagram illustrating?
The roots are underground.
Yep, so these roots are underground, they are embedded in soil. So these plants are going to be getting their nitrogen from the soil. Where do sources of soil nitrogen come from? Who is that was just talking?
That was Dominic.
Oh, Dominic, what did you say first?
The bacteria.
Yeah, so we have all these bacteria. Bacteria doing nitrogen fixation, bacteria doing nitrification, bacteria doing ammonification, bacteria doing all of these transformations that take atmospheric nitrogen out of the atmosphere, get it into soil, and then get it transformed within soil into these various forms of soil. So all of these bacteria involved in all of this are basically determining the rate at which we generate ammonium, the rate at which we generate nitrate, and that then affects the ability of plants to uptake those things. So part of it is just how much supply is there in the soil that helps influence assimilation. Is there another group of organisms that help plants absorb nutrients and water and things like this from the soil? And I don't think we've talked about these yet in class, except maybe in a plant or animal, a plant of the day sort of thing. I don't even think we've done that yet. You guys ever heard of mycorrhizal fungi? Anybody? Okay, then we'll just go. Mycorrhizal fungi are a type of fungus that is associated once again with the roots of plants, but they're different from the fungi or from the bacteria that are in nitrogen fixing legumes. So these are fungi, and while a legume has bacteria in little plant nodules on the root of the plant, mycorrhizal fungi generally sheathe the plant root, or they can also grow inside of the plant root. But what they do for the plant is they send out fungal mycelia. Mycelia are these projections of the body of the fungus out into the soil. And so fungus root, mycorrhiza, is what mycorrhiza translated is just fungus root. These are these fungi that are found in association with roots. And what they do is they enable the plant to send out projections into the soil, but it's not projections of the plant root. Plant roots send out root hairs, but those are really, really short. Fungi can send out mycelia much further out into the soil. And so the root can get access to a much greater volume of soil through its interaction with these mycorrhizal fungi. And so you have two different types of mycorrhizal fungi, arbuscular and ericoid. The arbuscular ones, if I'm recalling correct, are the ones that make a sheath around the plant root, and the ericoid ones actually embed themselves inside the plant root and then send out these mycelia into the soil. And so here you can see one of the ectomycorrhizae and our wait, did I get that right, Nathan? I should have looked this up before I came to class.
I think the arbuscular make these, so this little branching structure that's inside the cell, I think that's arbuscle.
Oh, okay, I got it flipped in my head then. Oh no, but these are both endomycorrhizae, sorry. These are endomycorrhizae. These grow into the plant cell. We have arbuscular ones that look like a tree, and then we have these ericoid ones that look like little spheres. Yeah. That's what I was messing up. These are endomycorrhizae. They grow into the plant root and then send out mycelia to the outside, as opposed to ectomycorrhizae, which form this sheath around the outside of the plant. And you can see that there are spots here where the root is sticking out, where the ectomycorrhiza has been broken, and you can see that root is quite thin, but the ectomycorrhiza makes this thick sheath around it. And what this enables you to do is you have the main root structure of the plant, but then most of this light colored area out here that is really giving this plant access to the soil, these are all fungal mycelia. And when you go digging through leaf litter, you can definitely see these fungal mycelia traveling through the soil as you're digging through leaf litter looking for insects or things like this. And what that does is it gives this plant root access to a big volume of soil that it normally wouldn't have available to it, because the roots themselves don't extend that far out into the soil, whereas the mycelia of the fungus does. You guys are probably most familiar with fungi when you see a mushroom. A mushroom is really just a fruiting body of the fungus. Most of the mass of the fungus is underground, unseen until that fungus goes to root, and it's all in the form of these mycelia sending out these tentacles throughout the soil.
If you ever pick a mushroom and then look in the soil at the bottom, at the base of it, you'll see the white hairs just like you would if you look through compost or decaying leaf litter. You'll see these white hairy networks, and that's the mycelia. That's what makes soil and life on land possible.
Yeah, and fungi are some of the largest organisms on the planet because they exist in these underground networks. And so I forget, how big is the one in Europe, Nathan, you're
I was
familiar
thinking
with?
of the one in Oregon. Mushroom. I don't have the acres memorized, but it's enormous.
Yeah, some of these things cover really large areas, but because it's all underground and it's all in these thin filaments, these mycelia, you don't really get a sense for it until you start taking soil cores around, and then you sequence the fungi that are in those soil cores, and you find that the same individual fungus keeps cropping up over and over and over again. And it's because it's this large underground organism that covers huge amounts of area. And so
there's one in Oregon that's estimated to, if you could weigh all of its mycelia, it would be something like 10,000 tons of mushroom.
Yeah, and that's a single individual. It's not a community of fungus. It's not a population of fungus. It's a single individual fungus.
Spread out over 3.5 square miles.
3.5 square miles. That's big. So you can get access to huge amounts of soil by getting mycorrhizal fungi on your team as a plant. So this should be pretty easy. In this particular situation, you have a plant involved in a symbiotic relationship with a fungus. What is the plant getting out of the deal? This should be easy. We just talked about it. Audrey, help me out.
Do they get access to a larger area and more nitrogen?
Okay, so they're going to get access to more nitrogen. What else is in the soil that they might want access to? Sydney.
Would it be like water and then just like other nutrients?
Yeah, so we used to think of mycorrhizal fungi mainly as being involved in nutrient supply and nutrient mobilization to the plant. But there have been a number of studies that started, I think, back when I was in graduate school that also showed that they were very important in water balance as well. So anything in the soil, whether it's nitrogen or phosphorus or sulfur or iron or water, whatever, all those things can be brought to the plant roots by the fungus. And then, of course, what does the fungus get out of the deal? Anybody else?
Glucose.
Yeah, they're getting energy. They're getting glucose, which once again, plants presumably have a superabundance of, especially during the growing season. So once again, this would be a mutualism. And so this is a diagram that just kind of shows you the basis of this. The root hairs of plants only go a certain distance into the soil, but then when the mycorrhizal fungi are associated with the roots, the mycorrhizal fungi send their mycelia much further out into the soil than the roots themselves. And you can get phosphorus, you can get nitrogen, you can get water, you can get all sorts of things being transported to the plant root by these fungal mycelia. And so we normally think of the rhizosphere as the area of the soil where the plant root directly interacts with the soil. And then this is the mycorrhizosphere, which is a much bigger area, much bigger volume, where the mycorrhizae interact with the soil and then can bring things from that larger volume into the plant root. So these were all inputs from the atmosphere into the ecosystem and primarily into soils for the most part. But then we can also take nitrate that is found in the soil and blow it back off back into the atmosphere through the process of denitrification. So we had nitrification, which made nitrate, and we also have denitrification, which breaks nitrate down and converts it back into atmospheric nitrogen, which then diffuses into the atmosphere from soil. Once again, no surprise, who does these processes?
Bacteria.
Bacteria does these processes. Once again, they're using these compounds in their own metabolism, and the byproduct is that they produce atmospheric nitrogen. And so this is going to be increased where you have low oxygen, high nitrate availability, and high carbon availability. Volatilization, we have talked about. When you burn the prairie, a certain amount of that nitrogen that is found in the bodies of those grasses and forbs is going to be converted back into nitrogen gas and then lost to the atmosphere as that biomass burns off. It'll also be lost in the volatilization of ammonia, and this is all done at high temperatures when you have fire burning through ecosystems. And then I think the other output, the only other output that we're going to talk about is leaching. Leaching is once again when water percolates through soil. Because water is a polar molecule, it can latch on to positively and negatively charged ions and drag those ions along with water through the soil. So when nitrate, which is a negatively charged ion, comes into contact with the partial positive hydrogen atoms in water, those hydrogen atoms will latch on to the negatively charged nitrate ion and pull that ion through the soil. And then as the water flows through the soil and eventually exits the soil and flows out into stream flow, whatever it's leaching out gets taken with it. And so that's how nitrate leaves the soil. But nitrate will also, as it leaves the soil, because it's negatively charged, it will also then grab onto positively charged cations and remove those as well. And so leaching is a general thing that happens in soils, but it's the process by which these positively and negatively charged ions get pulled out of water, pulled out of soil through the action of water flowing through that soil. And this is actually one of a pretty significant loss of nitrogen from the system. So nitrogen leaves soil through both through denitrification, which is a big chunk of it, but also through leaching, and to a lesser degree through volatilization, because not all areas are subject to periodic fires.
When you're reviewing this, you can ask yourself, what was the role of leaching in the Hubbard Brook example when we talked about succession?
Exactly. Yep. So this is complicated. And so what I want to have you do for homework for next time, you don't have to turn this in, but one of the ways that you can think about this is, how am I going to systematize all of this? And I found a productive way of doing this to be to make a table where you start on your table with what is the process, or what is the flux, if you want to think of it that way, which is probably a more productive way. What's the flux? What's the beginning form of nitrogen? What's the end form of nitrogen? Who accomplishes this transformation? And then where does this transformation occur? This will begin to help you through the process of trying to maybe latch on to something as complicated as the nitrogen cycle. This is the final nitrogen cycle. It will help you with that process of building that table. Before we talk about Veen et al. On Friday, I have a couple of more things to finish up with regards to nitrogen, and then we'll talk about Veen. Questions? All right, if you need assistance with your preparation of your Veen et al. Paper, let us know. I already have appointments with students today and tomorrow about that, but there's always room for more if you need a hand. Tessa, can you stay on for just a minute?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Cool. I'll see the rest of you on Friday if I don't see you before.